Chapter 1. Around the fire it is night in a time so far back that the names of the people have long been forgotten. The air is cool and carries the faint scent of smoke. A small group sits close together around a low fire. The flames sway and crackle, casting light on faces that lean forward to listen. The sound of the fire is constant, a soft rhythm under the quiet murmur of voices. No walls surround them. Only the dark shapes of trees and the endless sky overhead. These gatherings were the earliest form of what we might now call politics. There was no word for it then, and there was no need for one. Life was a daily task of finding food, keeping warm and staying safe. Yet even in these simple conditions, decisions had to be made. Who would hunt the next day, and who would stay to tend the fire? Where they would travel when the weather began to change. How they would handle the sight of strangers near the edge of their camp. There was no single ruler in these groups. The people who spoke most often were those who had lived longest, who remembered the paths through the forest, who could read the signs in the wind and the tracks in the soil. Experience was the first kind of power. It did not require force. It came from the quiet authority of having seen many seasons and survived them all. When one of these elders spoke, the others listened, not because they had to, but because it seemed wise. The fire itself was a kind of meeting place. In the day, the group would scatter to gather roots, to search for berries, or to track an animal. At night, they returned to the same circle of light. This was where stories were told, where lessons were passed to the younger ones, and where the affairs of the group were considered. The order of speaking was not fixed. Someone might interrupt with a new thought, and others would respond. But in the end, the group reached a choice that felt shared. These choices were rarely recorded, for there was no writing yet. They lived only in memory. If someone forgot, another would recall. Memory was a living store of agreements and lessons, kept not in stone but in the minds of the people. It meant that nothing was permanent. A choice made one night could be changed the next if a new idea arose. Flexibility was as important as any rule. Sometimes disagreements grew heated. One person might feel their view was ignored. Another might feel that danger was near, while others believed it far away. Voices would rise, and the firelight would throw sharp shadows on tense faces. Yet most disputes were settled by talking, or by a quiet walk away into the dark to cool one's thoughts. Fighting within the group was dangerous. It could weaken their ability to face the greater dangers of cold, hunger, or predators. The subjects they discussed were not the abstract laws of later times. They were practical and urgent. Where to find the herds that moved with the seasons? Which stream carried the cleanest water? How to guard the sleeping place from the sudden rush of a wild animal? In these talks, politics was simply the art of deciding together. The circle around the fire also reinforced a sense of belonging. The faces seen each night were the same, and each one was a part of the group's survival. This bond was the foundation on which all early political life was built. There were no written constitutions, but there was an unspoken understanding that every member mattered and had a place. Sometimes travelers from other groups appeared. They came with news of distant places, with different ways of making decisions, and sometimes with warnings. Around the fire, the group would weigh whether to welcome them, to share food, or to move away quietly. Such encounters were lessons in the wider world, showing that there were many ways to live and to choose. Even the act of tending the fire could carry meaning. A person who kept it alive through the night was trusted. That trust could lead to influence in other matters. In this way, the simple tasks of daily life became tied to the patterns of respect and authority. When the night was deep and the voices grew tired, someone would stir the coals one last time and cover them to keep the warmth until morning. The group would lie down close together, the fire still glowing faintly. The decisions made that night would guide them when the sun rose, until the next time they gathered in the circle. In these quiet meetings by the fire, we see the roots of all that would follow. The rise of leaders, the making of rules, the settling of disputes. It began with people sitting together, speaking in turn, listening, and finding a way forward. It was not grand, and it was not written in any record, but it shaped the way humans would live together for thousands of years to come. Chapter 2. The First Leaders in Time. Some people in these small bands began to take on a role that set them apart. It was not marked by a crown or a throne. It came quietly through a mix of skill, memory, and the respect of others. These were the first leaders. Often, they were the ones who could read the world most clearly. A sudden change in the wind might tell them that a storm was near. The movement of birds overhead could show them where game might be found. They seemed able to connect the smallest signs into a picture that guided the group. In a life where one wrong choice could mean hunger or danger, this skill was deeply valued. Leadership did not always belong to the oldest, though age often brought experience. Sometimes it rested with someone younger who had shown unusual insight or courage. Perhaps they had led a successful hunt when others had failed, or perhaps they had found a hidden spring in a time of drought. Word of such acts spread within the group and slowly built a sense of trust. The first leaders did not rule from above. They lived as part of the group, sharing the same food, walking the same paths, sleeping by the same fire. What set them apart was the way others turned to them when choices had to be made. They might speak more often in gatherings, or be the ones to make the final suggestion after all had been heard. Influence could be shown in small moments. A leader might decide the timing of a journey, urging the group to move before the first frost. They might choose who would scout ahead or who would stay to guard the camp. Such decisions were not commands in the way later rulers would give them. They were proposals, accepted because most felt they were wise. There was also a sense that leadership could be lost. A person who led poorly, who brought the group into danger or wasted their strength, could quickly lose the trust that had been built. In such cases, another voice might rise to take their place, and the group would follow the one who seemed more capable. Power was light to hold but easy to drop. Some leaders held their place through knowledge of stories and traditions. These were not tales told for amusement alone. They carried lessons from past events, where to find food after a flood, how to treat an injury from a certain animal, when to leave a valley before the snows came. To know these things was to guide the group's survival. In remembering and repeating them, a leader kept the past alive and used it to shape the present. Others led because they could settle disputes. Even in small groups, tempers could rise. Two hunters might argue over a piece of meat, or someone might feel wronged when another took their tools without asking. A leader who could calm such tensions and leave all sides feeling heard was valuable. They kept the group whole when anger might have broken it apart. The first leaders also often played a part in meeting outsiders. When another band approached, it was the leader who stepped forward to speak. They might exchange gifts or words, weighing whether this meeting would bring danger or opportunity. In these moments, the leader's calm and judgment could shape the future of the group. While the role brought respect, it also carried weight. A leader's advice might lead the group into hardship, and the memory of such mistakes could linger. Some must have felt the quiet pressure of knowing that their words could change many lives. Others might have sought to share the task, calling on other respected voices to guide decisions together. There was no fixed ceremony for becoming a leader. It happened gradually, as more and more people looked to the same person for guidance. And just as it could begin slowly, it could also fade without notice. If someone else seemed better able to guide the group through a season or a challenge, attention would shift, and leadership would move with it. In these early patterns, we see the seeds of what would later become formal systems. The idea that some are trusted to guide, that their words carry more weight, and that their role depends on the will of the group. It was not yet written into law, but it lived in the habits of the people. The first leaders were not distant figures. They were part of the shared work and the shared dangers. Their strength lay not in command, but in trust. And that trust was built one decision at a time, around the fire, on the trail, or in the face of the unknown. When the group moved, it was often at the leader's suggestion. When they stayed, it was because the leader had seen a reason. In this quiet exchange between one voice and many listeners, politics began to take shape in a form we can still recognize today. Chapter 3: Villages and Rules in Time. People began to stay longer in one place. The wandering paths of the past slowly gave way to the idea of a fixed home. The reason was simple. Farming had taken root. Seeds planted in the ground would grow into food, but only if they were tended. It was easier to care for these fields if people lived nearby. Slowly, small clusters of homes appeared, and the first villages began to form. Life in a village was different from life on the move. The group was larger, the faces more numerous, and the days filled with work that tied people to the same patch of land. Instead of gathering only what could be carried, there were tools to keep, baskets to weave, and shelters that could stand through many seasons. The fire was no longer the only shared space. There were paths between homes, common areas for work, and open ground for meeting. With this change came new challenges. When people stayed together in greater numbers, decisions became more complicated. It was no longer enough to agree on where to hunt the next day. Now there were questions about where each person's fields would lie, who would help with the harvest, and how to store grain for the winter. The first rules of village life were likely simple, shaped by necessity. A certain path might be kept clear for moving animals. Water from the nearby stream might be shared according to need. The group might agree that certain areas were for common use, while others belonged to a particular family. These agreements helped avoid quarrels and made daily work smoother. At first, rules lived in memory, just as they had in the days of small bands. But as villages grew, it became harder to remember every detail. The elders and leaders began to repeat the rules often, telling them to the young and reminding the old. Some rules were linked to the seasons, planting time, harvest time, the period when hunting certain animals was allowed. Others dealt with fairness, such as how to divide food in times of scarcity. With settled life came the idea of boundaries. A field was not just a piece of open land, but the work of someone's hands. To take from it without asking was to take from their labor. Disputes over such matters required calm voices to settle them. For a village could not risk open conflict within its own walls. Leaders who had once guided hunts now found themselves guiding conversations about land, tools, and shared duties. The rhythm of village politics was slower than the sudden decisions of a nomadic life. There was time to talk through a problem, to gather more than one opinion, to wait until everyone could be present. This patience was possible because the village would still be there the next day, and the next after that. The permanence of place allowed for a permanence of thought. As villages became more common, they also began to connect with one another. A path between two villages might see the passing of traders, travelers, or family members visiting from afar. These visits brought news of other ways to organize life. Some villages might have more than one leader. Others might hold gatherings where every adult could speak before a decision was made. These ideas traveled as surely as any goods. The first shared rules were probably tied to survival, but over time, they also reflected shared values. A village might choose to protect certain groves of trees, not only for their wood, but because they were seen as special. There might be customs about how guests were welcomed, or how disputes between families were resolved. These customs became part of the identity of the place, as much a marker of home as the shape of the houses or the pattern of the fields. In larger villages, it became harder for everyone to know everyone else. Trust had to be built through shared understanding of the rules. This was the beginning of something new. The sense that order could exist beyond personal relationships. People could rely on the structure of the village itself, not just on the goodwill of familiar faces. Yet even with rules, life was not without tension. Some might feel a rule was unfair or favored one family over another. Others might think the leaders were too quick or too slow in making decisions. These feelings were not new, but in a village they could not be solved by simply moving away. People had to find a way to live together despite their differences. The shift from wandering to staying brought more than planted fields and sturdy walls. It created a stage where politics could grow. The daily act of living side by side required agreements, and those agreements needed to be remembered, spoken, and sometimes changed. Out of these quiet choices, the idea of governance began to take shape, rooted in the soil of the village just as the crops were. In the evenings, people might still gather around a fire, but now the fire was in the heart of the village, its light falling on homes that would not be abandoned when the season turned. Here, under the steady glow, decisions were made that would last far longer than the flicker of the flames. And with each choice, the village wove itself more tightly together. Chapter 4. Chiefs and councils as villages grew in size and in number. The work of guiding them became more than a single person could carry. The tasks were many, and the voices to be heard were too numerous for one leader alone. This was when the idea of shared leadership began to appear, taking shape in the form of chiefs and councils. A chief was often the figure most trusted by the people. Sometimes they were chosen because they had led the village well through a season of trouble. Sometimes the role passed from parent to child, though not always. In some places, the community could refuse the heir of a former chief. if they felt the person lacked wisdom or care. A chief's power rested not on force alone, but on the willingness of the people to follow. The council was made up of other respected members of the village. They could be elders who knew the stories of the past, skilled hunters who understood the land, or healers whose knowledge kept the people healthy. Their purpose was to advise, to question, and to speak for parts of the community that the chief might not see every day. Meetings of the chief and council were often held in a central place. This might be a large house, a covered shelter, or simply an open space beneath a tree. The setting was chosen so that all could see and hear, for decisions made there would touch everyone. People could gather to listen, and sometimes they were invited to speak before the council discussed a matter in private. The work of such meetings covered many concerns. They might decide how to divide the land for planting, when to send hunting parties, or how to respond to a message from another village. They might settle disputes that smaller gatherings could not resolve, listening to each side and trying to find a fair path forward. A chief with a council could lead with greater strength because they did not stand alone. If a choice proved unwise, the blame was shared, and so too was the effort of finding a better way. The council also acted as a balance, ensuring that no one voice could decide everything without question. This balance kept the village steady through both good seasons and hard ones. The presence of a council changed the rhythm of decision-making. In earlier times, a leader might make a choice quickly in the heat of the moment. Now, matters could be discussed over several days, with each council member adding their view. Patience became a virtue, for the aim was to find agreement, not just to end the discussion. The council also served as a place where different parts of village life came together. A skilled farmer might know the needs of the fields, but little of the forests where hunters work. A healer might understand the signs of illness, but not the demands of building or defense. In council, these different pieces of knowledge were woven into a larger picture, helping the chief to guide the village as a whole. In some villages, councils grew to include representatives from every family or district. This made the council a mirror of the village itself, with each voice carrying the concerns of those they knew best. The more voices present, the more complex the discussion became, but it also meant that decisions rested on a broader base of understanding. Chiefs and councils also worked together to manage relations beyond the village. When a nearby settlement sought help or proposed a trade, the decision would not be left to one person. The council could weigh the risks and benefits, recalling past dealings and thinking ahead to future needs. This shared memory was one of their greatest strengths. The role of chief carried both respect and burden. They were the face of the village in times of peace and in times of trouble. If the harvest was good, the chief might receive praise. If the harvest failed, they might bear the blame, even if the cause was beyond anyone's control. A wise chief learned to share credit and accept fault with calm, knowing that their standing with the people could rise or fall with the turn of the seasons. Councils, too, carried responsibility. A poor choice in trade, an unfair ruling in a dispute, or a failure to prepare for a harsh winter could lead to doubt among the people. The strength of the council rested on the belief that its members acted for the good of all, not for their own gain. The partnership between chief and council was not always without tension. A chief might wish to act quickly while the council urged caution, or the council might press for a change that the chief felt unwise. Yet such differences, when handled with respect, could sharpen decisions and prevent mistakes. In the evenings, when the meetings were over, the chief might walk through the village, speaking with families, hearing their concerns directly. Council members might do the same, each in their own part of the community. In this way, the link between leadership and daily life remained strong, and the people felt that their voices reached those who decided in their name. The system of chiefs and councils was a step toward more complex forms of governance. It showed that leadership could be shared, that wisdom could be gathered from many minds, and that decisions could be shaped by more than a single perspective. In the quiet work of these gatherings, the roots of future governments were slowly growing. Chapter 5. Kingdoms and crowns. Over many generations, villages grew into towns, and towns into larger regions, where many communities shared a language, a way of life, and often the same dangers. The work of chiefs and councils was no longer enough to guide such large territory. A new form of leadership began to rise, the rule of kings and queens, marked by crowns and carried by the idea that one person could stand at the very heart of an entire realm. The path to kingship was different in each place. In some lands, a strong leader united many smaller groups by promise and persuasion, offering protection and the benefits of shared resources. In others, it was the sword that brought unity, as one chief defeated rivals, until no challenger remained. Over time, this single figure became more than a leader of a village or a council. They were seen as the ruler of all the land and the people within it. The crown was more than an ornament. It was a symbol of authority, often believed to carry the blessing of the gods or the weight of ancient tradition. King or queen might claim that their right to rule came from divine choice, making their position not only political but also sacred in the eyes of their subjects. This belief gave rulers a power that went beyond their personal strength, for to oppose them could be seen as opposing the will of higher powers. With kingdoms came new layers of governance. The ruler could not watch over every field or hear every dispute. They appointed trusted officials to carry out their will, collecting tribute, keeping order, and bringing news from distant corners of the realm. These officials might be nobles, warriors, or members of the ruler's own family. In this way, the structure of rule began to spread outward, with the crown at the center. The life of a kingdom was shaped by both the will of the ruler and the traditions of the land. Some monarchs ruled with a heavy hand, demanding obedience and punishing dissent. Others relied more on counsel, gathering advisors to help shape decisions. In many places, the role of the crown was balanced, or at times challenged, by assemblies of nobles, religious leaders, or even representatives of towns. A kingdom needed more than laws to hold it together. It required symbols and rituals that reminded people they were part of something greater. This could be a royal seal stamped on decrees, a flag carried into battle, or the great hall where the ruler held court. Festivals might be declared in honor of victories or religious events, drawing people from far and wide to share in the same celebrations. The stability of a kingdom often depended on the person wearing the crown. A wise and fair ruler could bring years of peace and prosperity. A careless or cruel one could see their realm weakened by unrest or rebellion. The succession of the crown was therefore a moment of great importance. In some lands it passed to the eldest child, in others to the most capable member of the royal family. Disputes over succession could lead to years of conflict, as rival claimants gathered support. While kingdoms were often presented as unified, they were rarely without tension. Local leaders might resist the demands of the crown, preferring to keep their own customs and authority. Towns might resent heavy taxes. Border regions might look to neighboring rulers for alliances. A monarch had to balance the needs of the center with the realities of the farthest reaches of their domain. The crown also had a role in shaping the identity of the realm. The language used in the royal court, the style of dress, the forms of greeting, all could spread through the land as people sought to imitate the ways of the ruler. This influence extended beyond politics, shaping art, music, and the telling of history itself. In times of war, the crown became the rallying point. Banners bearing the royal emblem would be raised, and armies would gather in the ruler's name. Victory brought glory to the monarch, while defeat could weaken their claim to rule. In peace, the crown could focus on building new roads, grand buildings, and alliances through marriage with other royal houses. Yet, even in the grandeur of palaces and the pageantry of coronations, the roots of kingship could still be traced back to the earliest fireside gatherings. The crown was a distant reflection of that first moment when one voice was trusted above the rest. The difference was in scale. The trust of a handful of companions had grown into the loyalty, or at least the obedience, of thousands. In the great halls of stone, surrounded by guards and advisors, a ruler might still face the same question that the first leaders had heard long ago. How do we keep our people safe, fed, and united? The answers had grown more complex, but the heart of the matter remained the same. The era of kingdoms and crowns would shape much of the world for centuries. It set the stage for both the splendor and the struggles of future politics, leaving behind traditions and symbols that would endure even after the crowns themselves lost their power. Chapter 6. Temples and Power. In many kingdoms, the power of the crown was matched, and sometimes overshadowed, by the power of belief. Religion was woven into daily life, and the temples stood as symbols of this connection between the people, their rulers, and the divine. Built from stone, wood, or clay, these places rose above the homes around them, their walls marked with carvings, paintings, or symbols that told the stories of gods, ancestors, and creation itself. From the earliest days of settled life, the act of worship had been a gathering point. People came together to give thanks for harvests, to ask for rain, to seek protection from illness or war. The leaders of these rituals became figures of influence. In some places, they were separate from the rulers. In others, they were the same person, holding both spiritual and political authority. Temples were not only places of prayer. They were also centers of knowledge. The priests in attendance kept records of seasons, stored sacred objects, and preserved stories from times long past. They studied the stars, marked the solstices, and kept track of the passage of years. In a world where such knowledge could guide the planting of crops or the timing of journeys, it was a form of power as real as any army. Rulers understood the value of this influence. A king or queen who stood beside the priests, who made offerings at the temple, could present themselves as chosen or blessed by the gods. This connection gave their rule a weight that went beyond human choice. It suggested that to follow the ruler was to follow a divine plan. The relationship between temple and crown was often one of mutual need. The ruler offered protection, gifts, and land to the temple. In return, the priests might bless the ruler's reign, declare that victories were signs of divine favor, or warn that rebellion would bring divine punishment. Together, they shaped not only the laws but the beliefs of the people. Temples also played a role in the economy. Offerings of grain, livestock, and goods flowed into their storerooms. These could be used to feed the poor, to host festivals, or to trade for resources from other lands. In this way, the temple became a center of wealth and a force in the life of the kingdom beyond its spiritual duties. Festivals tied to the temple's calendar brought the community together. They might involve processions through the streets, music and dancing, or the lighting of great fires. For many, these events were the most vivid moments of the year, a time when everyday work paused and the people felt part of something larger. Through such shared experiences, both faith and loyalty were renewed. Yet the union of temple and crown was not without its tensions. A ruler might wish to raise taxes or go to war, while the priests counseled against it. The temple might support a rival claimant to the throne if they believed the ruler had lost divine favor. In such moments, the two powers could become open rivals, each with its own followers and influence. There were also places where the temple held the greater power, with the ruler serving more as a representative of the gods than as an independent leader. In such systems, laws could be declared sacred, unchangeable by human hands, and the ruler's role was to uphold them rather than to shape them. The architecture of temples often reflected the importance of their role. Some were vast and filled with columns, others carved into mountainsides or built high on platforms so that they seemed closer to the heavens. Entering such a space could feel like stepping into another world. The cool shadow, the scent of incense, the flicker of lamps or torches on polished stone. These settings impressed upon all who entered the greatness of the powers being honored. In smaller communities, the temple might be a simple structure, yet it still held a central place. It was where disputes were settled by oaths, where agreements were sealed in the presence of the sacred, where the sick came for blessings and travelers for protection before setting out. Over time, the blending of political and religious power shaped the identity of entire cultures. Stories told in temples could become the guiding myths of a people, shaping their understanding of the past and their hopes for the future. Rulers could rise or fall depending on how closely they aligned themselves with these sacred narratives. Even in later centuries, when the direct power of temples waned in some regions, their influence remained. Customs, festivals, and moral codes they fostered continued to shape the lives of the people. Many of the oldest laws and traditions were born not in palaces, but in the quiet spaces where incense curled upward and voices spoke softly to unseen powers. The union of temples and power was one of the earliest and most enduring partnerships in political history. It joined the authority of human leadership with the weight of belief, binding people together in ways that went beyond fear or reward. It was a reminder that politics was not only about land and law, but also about the shared sense of meaning that holds a community together. Chapter 7. Writing the law for countless generations. The rules that shaped daily life had been spoken, remembered, and passed from one voice to another. They lived in the minds of elders, in the rituals of the temple, and in the habits of the people. But memory could be fragile. Words might be forgotten or changed, and different speakers could recall the same event in different ways. As communities grew larger and more complex, the need arose for something more permanent. The answer was to place the law into writing. In some lands, this was done on clay tablets, pressed with the marks of a stylus. In others, laws were carved into stone so that they could be seen and read by anyone who passed. The first written codes were often simple in form, yet powerful in meaning. They set down in fixed words what had once been only spoken, giving a sense of certainty to those who lived under them. To write the law was to claim that it belonged to the whole community, not just to those in power at the moment. It meant that the rules could be known, studied, and repeated exactly, even by those far from the place where they were first declared. This permanence was both a promise and a restraint. A ruler could no longer change the rules without leaving a visible mark of the change. The earliest written laws often dealt with matters of trade, property, and personal safety. They described what should happen if someone damaged another's goods, if a debt went unpaid, or if a person caused harm to another. Punishments were set out clearly so that all could see the price of breaking the rules. In some codes, the idea of fairness appeared in the form of equal treatment for all citizens, though in practice, the powerful were often still treated more gently than the poor. Temples sometimes played a role in preserving these laws. Stone pillars or tablets might be placed in sacred spaces, watched over by priests. This gave the laws not only a public presence, but also a sacred weight. To break the law was not only to defy the ruler, but also to offend the gods. The act of writing the law changed politics in subtle ways. Disputes could now be settled by pointing to a fixed text, rather than relying on memory or personal testimony alone. Those who could read became valuable to rulers, for they could interpret and enforce the written rules. Scribes, once simply keepers of records, became part of the machinery of governance. Writing also allowed for the spread of laws beyond the place of their origin. A kingdom might inscribe its rules on tablets and send copies to distant towns, ensuring that the same standards were known in every part of the realm. In this way, law became a tool for unifying lands that might otherwise have kept their own local customs. Yet the permanence of writing did not mean that laws were unchanging. Over time, new rules were added, old ones altered or removed. When this happened, the changes themselves were recorded, creating a visible history of the way a community's values and priorities shifted through the years. Some rulers used written law to show their justice and wisdom. They might commission large stone monuments inscribed with detailed codes, placing them in public squares for all to see. These displays were both practical and symbolic, a reminder that the ruler's authority rested on more than force alone. Others, however, saw written law as a way to tighten control, setting down strict rules that left little room for negotiation or local custom. For ordinary people, the presence of written law could be both a comfort and a burden. It offered protection against the whims of a ruler or official, for a decision could be tested against the words carved in stone. But it also meant that ignorance was no defense, and even small infractions might be punished according to the letter of the code. In markets and meeting places, the written law became part of daily conversation. A trader might remind a customer of a rule about weights and measures. A farmer might cite a law about the use of water from a shared stream. Over time, these words, once the private knowledge of leaders and priests, became part of the common language of the people. The decision to write the law was a turning point in political history. It shifted power in subtle ways, from the fleeting memory of individuals to the enduring mark of the written word. It allowed communities to grow larger without losing their shared rules, and it laid the foundation for the systems of justice that would follow. In the quiet of a scribe's workshop, as the stylus pressed into clay or the chisel struck stone, the future of governance was being shaped. Each mark was more than a symbol. It was a promise, a warning, and a record. A voice carried across generations, speaking of what was right, what was forbidden, and what it meant to live together in peace. Chapter 8. City-states and citizen-sized towns grew into bustling centers of trade, craft, and learning. Some of them became more than just parts of a kingdom. They developed their own governments, their own identities, and their own identities. These were the city-states, places where the walls marked not only the edge of the settlement, but also the limits of its political power. In a city-state, the idea of citizenship began to take clearer shape. To be a citizen was to belong in a way that carried both privilege and responsibility. It meant the right to speak in the assembly, to vote on certain matters, and to share in decisions that shaped the life of the community. It also meant serving in the defense of the city when danger approached, and contributing to its upkeep through taxes or labor. The heart of a city-state was often its public gathering place. This might be a market square, a wide-open plaza, or a meeting hall. Here, merchants traded goods, neighbors exchanged news, and political life unfolded in the open air. Speeches could be given to the assembled crowd, proposals debated, and alliances formed. In some city-states, political power rested in the hands of a few wealthy families. These oligarchies claimed to act for the good of all, though their decisions often favored their own interests. In others, a broader portion of the population could take part, creating the earliest forms of democracy. This did not mean that everyone had a voice. In many cases, women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. But it was still a significant change from the rule of kings and distant councils. The idea that citizens could meet to decide their own laws was a powerful one. It gave the people a sense of ownership over their city and its future. In some places, citizens were chosen by lot to serve in public roles for a set period of time, ensuring that many had the chance to take part. In others, positions were filled by election, with candidates speaking before the assembly to win support. City-states were often centers of culture as well as politics. Their independence encouraged a sense of pride that found expression in art, architecture, and public festivals. Great temples, theaters, and monuments were built to honor the gods, celebrate victories, or remember leaders who had guided the city well. These works were visible signs of the city's wealth and ambition, as well as its identity. The freedom of a city-state could be fragile. Without the resources of a large kingdom, they were vulnerable to attack from stronger neighbors. Many formed alliances for mutual defense, though these agreements could quickly shift with the changing fortunes of war and trade. A city might be a trusted ally one year and a rival the next. Citizenship itself could be a source of conflict. Those who were excluded might resent the privileges of the few, leading to unrest. Debates over who should have the right to speak and vote were as old as the assemblies themselves. At times, these debates turned violent, and leaders were forced to choose between expanding rights or tightening control. The life of a city-state was a constant balancing act between freedom and order, between the voices of the many and the authority of the few. The public spaces that encouraged open debate could also become places of protest, where crowds demanded change or challenged leaders directly. Despite these tensions, the model of the city-state left a lasting mark. It showed that politics could be a shared activity, not just the concern of a ruler or a small council. It gave rise to the idea that laws could be made in the open, debated by those they would affect, and agreed upon by the people themselves. For those who lived within its walls, the city-state was more than a place of residence. It was a community bound by shared rules, shared pride, and a shared future. The rights and duties of citizenship became part of personal identity, shaping how people thought of themselves and their place in the world. Even centuries later, when many city-states were absorbed into larger empires, the memory of that shared political life endured. The language of citizenship, the value of public debate, and the belief in the people's role in governance would reappear in other times and places, each time reshaped to fit new circumstances. In the bustling streets and echoing assemblies of these ancient cities, politics moved from the closed rooms of rulers to the open spaces where ordinary voices could be heard. It was not yet the equal voice of all, but it was a step toward the idea that leadership could rise from the people themselves. Chapter 9. The Roman model among the many city-states of the ancient world. One would grow into a power so vast that its influence could still be felt long after its fall. Rome began as a small settlement on the banks of a river, but over centuries it expanded to control lands that stretched far beyond the horizon. Its political system, known as the Republic, offered a model that blended elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in ways that were both practical and enduring. At the heart of the Roman Republic was the Senate, a body made up mostly of wealthy and influential citizens. Senators were not chosen by the people in open elections, but were appointed from among those who had already held certain offices. They advised on matters of policy, oversaw finances, and shaped the direction of the state. Their voices carried great weight, yet the Senate alone did not rule. Alongside the Senate were elected officials called magistrates. The highest of these were the consuls, two leaders who shared power for a single year. This short term was meant to prevent any one person from holding too much authority. In times of crisis, however, the Romans could appoint a dictator, a single leader with near total power, but only for a limited period, often 6 months. Beneath the consuls were other magistrates who handled specific tasks. Some oversaw public works, others managed the courts, and still others organized festivals or supervised markets. Each role was part of a larger structure designed to keep the city functioning smoothly. One of the most important features of the Roman system was the principle of checks and balances. Power was divided so that no one group or individual could easily dominate. The Senate could propose laws, but the assemblies of citizens could approve or reject them. Magistrates could make decisions, but their actions could be challenged by other officials. This constant push and pull kept authority in motion, preventing it from settling too heavily in any one place. Citizenship in Rome carried significant meaning. Roman citizens had rights to vote, to appeal certain legal decisions, and to be protected by Roman law, even when traveling far from the city. At first, citizenship was limited to people from Rome itself, but over time, it was extended to allies and conquered peoples, creating a sense of shared identity across the growing territory. The assemblies of citizens played a central role in this system. In these gatherings, free male citizens could vote on laws, elect magistrates, and decide on matters of war and peace. While not all voices carried equal influence, the wealthier classes often had more sway. The idea that ordinary citizens could participate directly in major decisions was a powerful one. Rome's political life was closely tied to its military strength. Service in the army was both a duty and a path to honor for citizens. Victorious generals could return to the city as celebrated figures, sometimes using their fame to win political office. This connection between military success and political power was one of the Republic's strengths, but also one of its dangers. Over time, the balance that had kept the Republic stable began to shift. Wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few, and ambitious leaders learned to use the loyalty of their armies to challenge the authority of the Senate. Civil wars broke out, and the system that had endured for centuries gave way to a new form of rule: the Roman Empire, with a single emperor at its head. Yet even under the emperors, many elements of the old republic survived. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates still carried out their duties, and the language of shared governance remained part of Roman life. The idea of law as a central pillar of society endured, shaping not only the empire but also the nations that would follow. Roman law became one of the Republic's most lasting legacies. It was carefully recorded, organized, and refined over generations. Principles such as the right to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, and the idea that laws should apply equally to all citizens would echo through history, influencing legal systems far beyond Rome's borders. The Roman model was not perfect. It excluded many from political life, favored the wealthy, and often fell short of its own ideals. But it demonstrated that a large and diverse state could be governed through a combination of institutions, laws, and civic participation. It showed that leadership could be shared, that authority could be limited, and that the voice of the citizen, even if imperfectly heard, could be part of the machinery of power. In the forums and meeting places of Rome, politics was not a distant thing. It was something seen and heard every day, in speeches, in debates, and in the steady rhythm of elections and public decisions. This visibility made politics part of the public identity, a shared stage where the fate of the city was discussed not behind closed doors, but in the open air. Even after the fall of Rome, the memory of its republic would inspire later generations. Thinkers, leaders, and reformers would look back to its example, adapting its ideas to new times and places. The Roman model, shaped beside the Tiber River, would travel across continents and centuries, leaving its mark on the story of politics long after the city itself had changed. Chapter 10. The feudal ties. When the great empires of the ancient world weakened or fell, the lands they once ruled did not simply return to the small villages of earlier times. Instead, in many regions, a new pattern of power emerged, one built on personal bonds, mutual obligations, and the control of land. This system came to be known as feudalism, and it shaped the politics of the Middle Ages for centuries. At the heart of the feudal world was the land itself. Those who held the largest estates were often nobles, men and women whose families had long-standing claims to certain territories. They did not work the fields themselves, but relied on the labor of peasants who lived on and cultivated the land. In return for this labor, peasants were allowed to keep part of what they produced, and to live under the protection of their lord. Protection was more than a promise. In a time when raids, border disputes, and local wars were common, having a strong lord could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Castles with their thick walls and watchtowers became symbols of this protection. Within their walls, people could take shelter when danger came, trusting in the lord's ability to defend them. The ties between lord and vassal formed the backbone of the feudal order. A vassal was someone who pledged loyalty and service to a lord in exchange for land or privileges. This pledge was not merely a spoken agreement. It was often made in a formal ceremony, sealed by oaths and symbolic gestures, such as the exchange of a token or the clasping of hands. These bonds were personal and reciprocal. A vassal promised to support the lord in war, to give counsel when asked, and to manage the land faithfully. In return, the lord promised to protect the vassal, to respect their rights, and to provide the resources they needed to fulfill their duties. This mutual obligation was the glue that held the feudal system together. Above the lord stood kings, but their authority was often limited. In theory, the king was the highest ruler of the realm, yet in practice, many lords acted with considerable independence. A strong king could unite his nobles and lead them in common cause, but a weak one might struggle to enforce his will beyond his own court. Feudal ties extended downward as well. Just as lords had vassals, those vassals might have their own followers, creating a layered hierarchy of loyalty and obligation. This web of relationships could be complex, with one person serving as vassal to more than one lord, or lords owing service to different kings. The church was another powerful force within this system. Monasteries and bishops often held vast estates, making them important landowners as well as spiritual leaders. In some cases, the church acted much like a feudal lord, with peasants working its lands and knights defending its property. The moral authority of the church also gave it influence over political matters, from the settling of disputes to the crowning of kings. Feudal politics were local in nature. Most decisions that affected daily life were made within the manor or the lord's domain, not by distant rulers. Disputes were settled in the lord's court, where customs and tradition carried as much weight as written law. Loyalty was tied to people rather than to abstract institutions. This local focus did not mean that larger alliances were absent. Lords might join together for mutual defense, to support a king in war, or to take part in a crusade, but such unity was often temporary, lasting only as long as the shared interest did. Rivalries between neighboring lords could be intense, leading to skirmishes and sieges that disrupted life for those caught in between. For peasants, the feudal world was both stable and restrictive. The protection of a lord provided a measure of security, but it also bound them to the land. Most could not leave without permission, and their lives were shaped by the demands of the agricultural year. In return for their labor, they received the right to farm certain plots, gather wood from the forest, or graze animals on common land. The relationships of feudalism were maintained through ceremony and custom. Oaths of loyalty were renewed, disputes were resolved through negotiation or combat, and marriages were arranged to strengthen alliances. The language of honor and duty was central, for in a system without strong centralized control, trust between individuals was essential. Over time, changes in trade, warfare, and governance would weaken the bonds of feudalism. Towns grew, kings consolidated power, and the idea of centralized law began to challenge the authority of local lords. But for many centuries, the feudal ties provided the framework within which people lived, worked, and governed themselves. In the quiet of a rural manor, in the halls of a stone castle, and in the fields that stretched beyond, the politics of the Middle Ages unfolded not in grand assemblies or public debates, but in the daily honoring of oaths, the management of land, and the personal bonds between those who ruled and those who served. Chapter 11: Faith and Authority in the Feudal World. Power was not measured by land and armies alone. The church stood as a force that could guide kings, shape laws, and influence the lives of the poorest peasant and the highest noble alike. Its authority reached beyond borders, for it claimed to speak not just for human rulers but for the will of God. Faith was a constant presence in daily life. Bells from church towers marked the hours, calling people to prayer and reminding them of the rhythm of the sacred calendar. Births, marriages, and deaths were all blessed by the church. Seasonal festivals, from the planting of crops to the harvest, were tied to holy days and saints' feasts. In this way, the church's influence touched both the spiritual and practical sides of existence. For rulers, the blessing of the church could lend legitimacy to their reign. A coronation performed by a high-ranking church official was more than ceremony. It was a declaration that the ruler's authority was recognized by the divine. Without such recognition, a claim to power could seem incomplete, no matter how strong an army might be. Church leaders themselves often held significant political power. Bishops and abbots controlled large estates, collected rents, and maintained their own courts. Some were advisors to kings, helping to draft laws or negotiate treaties. Others acted as mediators in disputes between nobles, using their moral authority to urge peace or compromise. The relationship between church and crown could be one of partnership, but it could also lead to conflict. Kings sometimes sought to control the appointment of bishops, seeing these positions as key to maintaining influence over the lands the church governed. The church, in turn, resisted such interference, insisting that spiritual offices should be filled without the meddling of secular rulers. This tension could grow into open struggle. Disputes over authority might lead to excommunications, where a ruler was formally cut off from the church and its sacraments. Such a sentence could weaken a king's position, for it suggested that they had lost divine favor. In some cases, excommunication stirred rebellion, as nobles questioned the right of an unblessed ruler to govern. Beyond politics, the church was also a keeper of knowledge. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, copied manuscripts by hand, and maintained libraries. Monks and nuns tended gardens that grew medicinal herbs, offered shelter to travelers, and taught reading and writing to a small number of students. In an age when literacy was rare, the ability to read scripture and legal texts gave church officials unique influence in shaping laws and agreements. The church's moral teachings also informed the rules of society. Laws against certain crimes, expectations for charity, and customs surrounding marriage and inheritance often reflected religious principles. Even in regions where local customs were strong, church influence shaped the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Pilgrimage was another way in which faith and authority intertwined. Rulers sometimes sponsored the building of grand cathedrals or the maintenance of holy sites, drawing pilgrims from near and far. Such projects could strengthen both spiritual devotion and the economy, as pilgrims brought trade to the towns they visited. The church's reach extended across kingdoms, creating a network of shared belief that connected people who might otherwise have little in common. A farmer in a distant village and a noble in a royal court could both hear the same prayers, celebrate the same feast days, and recognize the same spiritual authority. This unity could be a source of stability, but it also gave the church the ability to act as a power that could rival kings. Conflicts between faith and secular rule did not always end in clear victory for one side. Often, they resulted in negotiated settlements where each side yielded some ground. Over time, these agreements shaped the boundaries between church and state, influencing how later governments would balance spiritual and political power. For the ordinary person, these struggles at the top might be distant, but their outcome mattered. A strong partnership between ruler and church could mean stability and peace. A bitter conflict could lead to unrest, higher taxes to fund disputes, or uncertainty about whose authority truly held sway. Faith and authority were deeply intertwined in the medieval world. The church gave moral and spiritual shape to political life, while rulers gave the church the protection and resources it needed to flourish. Each depended on the other, yet each guarded its own power closely. In the quiet of a cathedral, where sunlight streamed through colored glass, the union of the sacred and the political was made visible. Here, under vaulted ceilings, kings and peasants alike knelt before the same altar, bound together by belief and by the shared structures of their world. Chapter 12. Empires and bureaucrats. As kingdoms expanded, and rulers brought more lands under their control, the challenges of governing grew more complex. It was one thing to oversee a single realm where the ruler could travel in a few days to any corner. It was another to manage an empire, a vast collection of regions with different languages, customs, and landscapes. To hold such a territory together, rulers needed more than soldiers. They needed systems, records, and the steady work of administrators, the bureaucrats. Empires were built on the idea that diverse peoples could be united under a single authority. Sometimes this unity came through conquest, sometimes through alliances or the promise of trade and protection. But once the borders stretched far, the question became how to keep the distant provinces loyal and the flow of goods, taxes, and information steady. Bureaucracy provided the answer. A network of officials acted as the eyes, ears, and hands of the ruler. Governors oversaw provinces, ensuring that local laws aligned with imperial policy. Tax collectors gathered the resources needed to fund armies, build roads, and maintain public works. Scribes recorded decrees, tallied goods, and kept careful accounts of what was owed and what had been paid. The work of these officials was not always visible to the people, but it shaped daily life in countless ways. Roads and canals were planned and maintained, markets regulated, and disputes between provinces settled without the ruler having to be present. Bureaucrats could decide where to store grain in case of famine, how to organize defenses along the borders, and how to manage the flow of goods between regions. Communication was the lifeline of an empire. Messengers traveled along well-maintained routes, carrying orders from the capital to the farthest outposts. In some empires, relay systems allowed messages to move with remarkable speed, as fresh horses and riders waited at intervals. Without such systems, the vast reach of imperial rule would have been impossible to sustain. The presence of bureaucracy also allowed empires to adapt. Local customs could be respected as long as they did not conflict with imperial needs. A province might keep its traditional festivals, local leaders, and familiar laws, but it would also pay taxes, provide soldiers when called upon, and follow the decrees sent from the center. This balance between central authority and local autonomy was delicate, and skilled administrators were essential to maintaining it. Bureaucrats often came from a range of backgrounds. Some were nobles appointed by the ruler, trusted because of their family's loyalty. Others were chosen for their education, trained in reading, writing, and mathematics, so they could manage complex records. In some empires, examinations determined who could enter the bureaucracy, ensuring that positions went to those who proved their skill rather than to those born into privilege alone. The stability of an empire often depended on the efficiency of its administration. A well-run bureaucracy could collect taxes fairly, respond to crises quickly, and keep trade flowing. A corrupt or inefficient one could drain resources, anger the people, and weaken the authority of the ruler. Even the mightiest emperor relied on this network of unseen labor. A decision made in the capital was only as effective as the officials who carried it out hundreds or thousands of miles away. In this way, power was shared, though not in name. The bureaucrats held no crowns, but their work determined whether the empire thrived or faltered. Grand building projects often showcased the strength of both the ruler and the bureaucracy. Temples, palaces, roads, and aqueducts required careful planning, a steady supply of materials, and the coordination of labor across great distances. These projects could take years to complete, outlasting the reign of the ruler who had begun them, and standing as symbols of imperial power for generations. The people who lived within the empire might never see the ruler's face, but they felt the presence of imperial authority in the regular arrival of tax collectors, in the markets stocked with goods from faraway lands, and in the roads and bridges that connected their town to the rest of the realm. Over time, some empires grew so large that even the most efficient bureaucracy could not hold them together. Communication slowed, loyalty frayed, and local leaders began to act more independent. When the center weakened, provinces might break away, forming new states or falling under the rule of neighboring powers. Yet the systems built by these empires often survived their collapse. Roads, written laws, administrative divisions, and even languages spread by imperial rule could continue to shape the lands long after the empire itself was gone. Later rulers, even in very different times, would find themselves relying on the same tools, records, officials, and organized communication to govern their own territories. In the quiet rooms where scribes bent over their work, where clerks sorted documents and stamped them with official seals, the real machinery of empire turned. It was here, in the steady, patient labor of the bureaucracy, that the vast and distant lands were bound together into something that could be called a single state. Chapter 13. Ideas of freedom. Centuries passed. The ways people were governed continued to change, But the question of what made power just and fair began to take on new depth. Across different lands, thinkers, leaders, and ordinary citizens started to imagine forms of rule in which authority did not rest solely in the hands of a monarch or an empire. These ideas often grew slowly, shaped by the experiences of war, trade, learning, and the exchange of stories between cultures. The concept of freedom was not new. Even in ancient times, people valued the right to speak in assemblies, to own land, and to live without interference from distant rulers. But in earlier ages, such rights were often limited to a small portion of society. Now, in markets, in taverns, and in the quiet studies of scholars, the question was being asked more openly. Could more people share in the making of laws and the shaping of their own lives? Philosophers began to write about natural rights, the idea that certain freedoms belong to all people simply because they are human. These might include the right to life, to property, and to a fair hearing before judgment. Such ideas challenged the belief that power was a gift from the gods to a chosen few. Instead, they suggested that rulers themselves should be bound by rules, just as the people were. The spread of books and letters helped these thoughts travel faster and farther than ever before. Printing presses produced works that could be read in many places at once, allowing a single idea to take root across distant cities and countries. Coffee houses and public squares became spaces for discussion, where merchants, craftsmen, and travelers could share opinions on governance, trade, and the conduct of rulers. In some regions, these ideas remained topics for quiet debate. In others, they began to influence the way governments worked. Parliaments and assemblies expanded their role, limiting the direct power of kings. Charters were written to protect certain rights, promising that no person could be imprisoned or punished without due cause. The idea of freedom also carried with it the idea of responsibility. If people were to share in making the laws, they would also need to take part in defending them. This meant paying taxes to support common needs, serving in militias or armies, and respecting the rights of others even when disputes arose. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Those who held traditional power often feared that greater freedom for the many would mean less authority for themselves. Disputes over the balance between liberty and control could lead to unrest, and in some cases, open conflict. Still, the notion that rulers should serve the people, rather than the other way around, began to take stronger hold. Writers argued that the legitimacy of any government rested on the consent of the governed. If a ruler failed to protect the rights of the people, they claimed, it was not only the right, but the duty of the people to seek a new form of rule. Such ideas did not spread evenly or without challenge. In many places, they met with resistance from entrenched traditions, religious authorities, or economic systems that depended on strict hierarchy. But even where progress was slow, the seeds of change had been planted. In the arts, the language of freedom appeared in plays, poems, and songs. Painters depicted scenes of councils meeting, of citizens voting, and of leaders listening to the voices of the people. These works kept the vision of shared governance alive in the public imagination. The idea of freedom was also shaped by contact between different cultures. Traders, travelers, and diplomats brought home stories of governments that worked in unfamiliar ways. A merchant from one land might describe a distant city where leaders were chosen by popular vote, or where disputes were settled by a council of elders. Such accounts, whether entirely accurate or not, expanded the range of possibilities people could imagine. Over time, the discussion of freedom became not just a matter of political theory, but a force that could inspire movements. People began to gather in greater numbers to demand reforms, from fairer taxation to the abolition of certain injustices. Leaders who listened to these calls could strengthen their bond with the people, while those who ignored them risked growing unrest. The ideas of freedom did not promise a perfect world. They carried the challenge of balancing individual rights with the needs of the community, and of ensuring that the voices of the many did not drown out the rights of the few. Yet they offered a vision of politics built not only on the power of rulers, but on the shared dignity of all. In quiet libraries, in crowded markets, and in the chambers of parliaments, the language of liberty was taking shape. It would not be the same in every land, and it would often face opposition. But from this point on, the idea that people could and should have a hand in shaping their own governance would remain a central thread in the story of politics. Chapter 14. Revolutions began the ideas of freedom and shared governance that had grown quietly in books, meetings, and marketplaces did not remain only as words. In some places, they began to take shape as action. Frustration with unfair taxes, lack of representation, or the heavy hand of distant rulers turned into movements that called for real and lasting change. These moments, when the old order was openly challenged and new systems sought to take its place, came to be known as revolutions. Revolutions did not arise from a single cause. Often, they were the result of many pressures building over years. A poor harvest might bring hunger, which made people more aware of how unequally wealth was shared. New taxes to fund wars or royal projects might stir resentment among merchants and farmers alike. Restrictions on trade or the press could anger those who felt their voices were being silenced. The spark could be small, but it landed on dry ground. In many cases, the first steps toward revolution were peaceful. Groups gathered to petition rulers for reforms, to ask for fairer laws, or to demand a voice in decisions. Some rulers listened and made changes, easing tensions. Others refused, seeing such requests as threats to their authority. When words failed, action often followed. The gatherings grew larger. Crowds filled public squares, speeches rang out, and pamphlets were passed from hand to hand. These messages spoke of justice, of the rights of the people, and of the promise of a government that served all, not just the few. In some cities, these ideas inspired new assemblies to form, meeting in halls, churches, or even open fields to debate the future. Revolutions often faced opposition from those loyal to the old ways. Armies were called to disperse crowds, leaders of the movements were arrested, and newspapers were shut down. Yet suppression could fuel anger rather than end it. Acts of resistance multiplied. The refusal to pay certain taxes, the occupation of government buildings, or the breaking of laws seen as unjust. In some revolutions, change came swiftly. A ruler might step down, a new constitution might be written, and elections might be held to form a new government. In others, the struggle dragged on, marked by battles between opposing sides. Civil wars could erupt, dividing neighbors, friends, and even families. The goals of revolution varied. Some sought to replace a monarchy with a republic. Others aimed to limit the power of the crown while keeping a royal figure as a symbol of unity. Some were driven by economic reform, others by demands for religious freedom, or the abolition of slavery. What they shared was the belief that the existing system no longer served the needs of the people. Not every revolution achieved its aims. In some cases, new leaders rose only to repeat the patterns of the old, replacing one form of control with another. In others, the chaos of change opened the door to foreign invasion or internal collapse. Yet even revolutions that fell short could leave lasting marks: new laws, broader rights, or simply the memory that change was possible. The power of these movements often lay in their ability to inspire beyond their own borders. News of one revolution could travel quickly, carried by merchants, travelers, and printed papers. In distant lands, people read of ordinary citizens standing against armies, of assemblies drafting new laws, and of leaders promising a better future. These stories planted seeds in minds far away. Revolutions were not only moments of political change. They were also times when art, music, and literature flourished, giving voice to the emotions of the age. Songs were sung in the streets. Plays told the stories of heroes and martyrs, and paintings captured scenes of defiance or celebration. These works helped shape how the events were remembered, turning them into shared legends. For those who lived through them, revolutions were rarely simple or easy. They brought hope and fear in equal measure. The certainty of the old order was gone, but the shape of the new one was not yet clear. In the space between, there was both opportunity and danger. Yet the legacy of revolutions was enduring. They proved that governments could be challenged, and that the will of the people could reshape the structures of power. Even when the outcome was uncertain, the act of standing up for change carried its own kind of victory. In the quiet years that followed, many who had fought in these struggles looked back with mixed feelings: pride in what had been attempted, sorrow for what had been lost, and an understanding that the story of freedom was not a single moment, but a path that would need to be walked again and again. Chapter 15. The Age of Ideologies. When the waves of revolution began to settle, the world did not return to its old shape. The changes that had taken place left deep marks on politics, society, and the way people imagined their future. Out of this unsettled ground grew a new era, one defined by powerful ideas about how communities should be organized and how power should be used. These ideas, often called ideologies, became forces that could inspire hope, drive reform, and at times lead to fierce conflict. Liberalism was one of the most prominent of these movements. It grew from the belief in individual rights, constitutional government, and the protection of personal freedoms. Liberals argued that rulers should be limited by laws and that citizens should have a voice in choosing their leaders. They valued free trade, the rule of law, and the idea that talent and effort should open doors regardless of birth. In contrast, conservatism sought to preserve established traditions and institutions. Conservatives valued continuity, believing that sudden change could bring instability and harm. They often looked to monarchy, the church, and long-standing customs as sources of order. While they did not reject all reform, they preferred slow and careful adjustments rather than sweeping transformations. Nationalism was another powerful force in this period. It held that people who shared a common language, history, or culture should be united under their own government. In some places, nationalism inspired movements to break away from empires and form independent states. In others, it fueled the desire to bring scattered regions together into a single nation. National pride could bring unity, but it could also lead to rivalry and conflict with neighbors. Socialism emerged as a response to the inequalities that persisted despite political change. Socialists argued that wealth and resources should be shared more equally, and that the means of production, such as factories, land, and mines, should serve the common good rather than private profit alone. Some envisioned peaceful reform through laws and cooperation, while others believed that only a complete transformation of the system could bring true fairness. These ideologies did not exist in isolation. They met in parliaments, in newspapers, and in the streets, where supporters debated their visions for the future. In some countries, parties formed around these ideas, each seeking to win the support of the people and to shape government policy. Elections became contests not only of personalities but of principles. The Industrial Revolution added urgency to these debates. As cities grew and factories multiplied, new social challenges arose. Working conditions could be harsh, wages low, and housing overcrowded. Reformers called for labor laws, public education, and better living standards. Industrialists resisted some of these demands, fearing they would slow progress or reduce profits. Ideologies became tools for arguing over these issues, offering different answers to the same pressing questions. Beyond Europe, these ideas began to travel, carried by trade, migration, and the printed word. Colonized peoples read about self-government and equality, and some began to adapt these principles to their own struggles for independence. In turn, the realities of empire shaped how ideologies developed in the lands that held colonies, sometimes expanding the language of rights while denying them to certain groups. The age of ideologies was also an age of alliances and opposition. Groups with different views sometimes found common cause on specific issues, only to part ways when their broader goals clashed. A liberal and a nationalist might work together to end foreign rule, but disagree on the limits of individual rights once independence was achieved. The arts reflected and influenced these currents. Writers explored themes of liberty, duty, and the meaning of nationhood. Painters and composers celebrated the spirit of the people, the struggles of the worker, or the majesty of tradition. Public monuments honored heroes of reform or resistance, turning individuals into symbols of larger causes. While the clash of ideologies could be divisive, it also marked a growing belief that politics was not the domain of rulers alone. Ordinary people increasingly saw themselves as part of the process, able to choose sides, join movements, and shape the direction of their societies. Mass rallies, petitions, and public debates became part of political life, but these powerful ideas could also deepen divisions. The belief in one's own cause as the sole path to justice sometimes left little room for compromise. In some places, ideological conflicts led to unrest or even civil war. The promise of a better future was matched by the risk of upheaval if the competing visions could not find common ground. By the close of this era, politics had become a landscape of competing beliefs, each offering its own answer to to the question of how people should live together. The age of ideologies had expanded the conversation beyond kings and parliaments to include the voices of citizens, workers, and reformers. It had also shown that ideas, once released into the world, could not be easily contained. In the cafes, the assembly halls, and the pages of pamphlets, the debates continued, shaping the modern world. The choices made in this period, between tradition and change, between individual and community, between nation and humanity, would echo in the political struggles that followed. Chapter 16. Democracy expansed. Competing visions of the age of ideologies did more than fill newspapers and fuel debates. In many parts of the world, they began to change the structure of governments and the role of ordinary citizens within them. Step by step, the idea that political power should be shared more widely took root, and the institutions of democracy, once limited in scope, began to open their doors to more people. In earlier times, even where elections existed, the right to vote was often restricted to wealthy landowners or members of certain classes. The reasoning was that those with property had the greatest stake in the decisions of government. Over time, this argument lost its force as more people demanded a say in the laws that governed their lives. Expanding the vote became one of the central aims of reformers in many countries. The movement for broader suffrage often advanced in stages. First, property requirements were lowered or removed, allowing more men to participate. Later, attention turned to other excluded groups: industrial workers in cities, farmers in rural areas, and eventually women, all pressed for the right to cast a ballot. These demands were not always met peacefully. Marches, petitions, and sometimes arrests marked the struggle for equal political voice. The expansion of democracy was not only about voting. It was also about access to education, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble. A vote held little meaning if people could not read the laws, hear different viewpoints, or gather to discuss the issues of the day. Reformers pushed for public schooling, for newspapers free from censorship, and for protections that allowed citizens to meet without fear of punishment. Political parties began to form around these expanding electorates. Where once a small circle of elites might decide the course of policy, now candidates needed to speak to broader audiences. Public meetings, campaign posters, and printed pamphlets became common tools for winning support. The style of politics shifted toward mass participation, and leaders learned to appeal to the hopes and concerns of a wider public. In some places, the expansion of democracy came through steady reform. Laws were passed, elections held, and new voters added to the rolls without major upheaval. In others, the process was shaped by protest and confrontation. Strikes, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience pressed governments to act sooner than they might have otherwise. The question of women's suffrage became one of the defining struggles of this period. For centuries, women had been active in political movements, but their right to vote was often denied. Campaigns for women's suffrage took different forms, from polite lobbying to large public marches, and in some cases, acts of direct defiance. The eventual victories were hard-won and uneven, arriving earlier in some countries and later in others. As democracy expanded, new challenges arose. Larger electorates meant more diverse opinions and the need for systems that could manage disagreement without collapsing into disorder. Parliamentary procedures, judicial review, and independent institutions became important tools for balancing the will of the majority with the protection of minority rights. In nations with colonial possessions, the question of democracy was especially complex. While citizens at home gained new rights, people in colonies were often excluded from these reforms. This contradiction would, in time, fuel movements for independence and self-rule across the world. Technology also played a role in widening democracy's reach. Railways allowed candidates to travel quickly between towns, meeting voters face-to-face. Telegraph lines carried news of debates and election results, shrinking the sense of distance between citizens and their representatives. Later, radio and film would give political messages an even broader audience. The growth of democratic systems brought with it a new sense of civic responsibility. Citizens were expected not only to vote but to stay informed, to serve on juries, and to respect the outcomes of lawful elections. Civic education sought to prepare the next generation for this role, teaching both the rights and the duties that came with participation. The expansion of democracy was never a smooth or complete process. Gains could be reversed, and rights once granted could be restricted again in times of crisis. Economic depression, war, and political unrest sometimes led governments to limit freedoms in the name of security. Yet even in such times, the memory of broader participation remained, ready to be called upon when conditions allowed. By the early decades of the 20th century, democracy had spread further than at any previous time in history. Parliaments, congresses, and assemblies met in countries on every continent, shaped by local traditions, but linked by the shared belief that the people should have a role in governing themselves. In town halls, city squares, and national capitals, the act of casting a vote had become both a personal choice and a shared ritual, a moment when the many voices of a nation came together to decide its path. It was not a perfect system, and it faced constant tests, but it carried within it the promise that the story of governance belonged to the people as much as to their leaders. Chapter 17. The global stages. The 20th century unfolded. Politics was no longer only a matter for individual nations. The connections between countries grew closer, and events in one place could have swift and wide-reaching effects elsewhere. Trade, technology, migration, and war all drew the world into a web of relationships that made the idea of a truly global stage more real than ever before. The first half of the century saw 2 world wars, each reshaping borders, economies, and political systems. Alliances that had once been based mainly on local or regional concerns now spanned oceans. Soldiers, goods, and ideas moved across continents, and the outcome of battles fought far from home could determine the fate of entire nations. When the wars ended, the need for cooperation was clear. New organizations were created to help countries work together, resolve disputes, and address shared problems. Among these was the United Nations, founded with the hope of preventing future global conflicts. Member states met to discuss security, human rights, and development, bringing representatives from many different systems of government into the same rooms. The global stage was also shaped by the rise and rivalry of major powers. The Cold War divided much of the world into 2 broad camps, each led by a superpower with its own vision of governance and economic order. While the struggle was often political and economic, it also extended into culture, science, and space exploration. Smaller nations navigated this environment with care. Some aligned themselves closely with one side, while others sought neutrality, forming alliances with other non-aligned states to preserve independence in decision-making. Diplomacy became a delicate art, as leaders weighed their choices in a world where every move was watched and judged internationally. Global institutions grew alongside these tensions. Agreements on trade lowered barriers between countries, encouraging the flow of goods and investment. International courts were established to hear cases about disputes between states or violations of human rights. Conferences brought together experts to address challenges such as disease outbreaks, environmental degradation, and the regulation of new technologies. The media also transformed the global stage. Radio, television, and eventually the internet allowed events to be witnessed almost as they happened, regardless of distance. A speech by a world leader, an act of protest, or the signing of a treaty could be seen and heard across the planet within hours or even minutes. Public opinion was no longer confined within national borders. It could form and shift in response to events halfway around the globe. Economic interdependence deepened the ties between nations. Resources extracted in one country might be processed in another and sold in a third. Financial markets linked distant economies so closely that a crisis in one place could send ripples through many others. This interconnectedness made cooperation valuable, but it also meant that no country could be entirely insulated from global shocks. On the global stage, politics often meant balancing national interests with collective needs. Climate change, ocean pollution, and the spread of diseases ignored borders, demanding solutions that required countries to work together despite their differences. Negotiations could be long and difficult, as each nation sought to protect its own priorities while contributing to a common goal. The second half of the 20th century also saw the dismantling of colonial empires. Dozens of new nations emerged, each seeking a place in the global community. For some, independence brought stability and growth. For others, The legacy of colonial rule left deep divisions that took time to heal. The voices on the global stage became more varied, reflecting a wider range of histories, cultures, and perspectives. International politics could be a stage for both unity and division. Peacekeeping missions brought together soldiers from many countries to stabilize conflict zones. At the same time, disagreements over trade rules, military actions, or the handling of crises could strain relationships. The global stage was rarely still. It was a place of constant movement and negotiation. By the dawn of the 21st century, the pace of connection had only increased. Digital communication made it possible for governments to coordinate rapidly, for activists to rally support internationally, and for news, both true and false, to spread across the world in moments. The challenges of this interconnected age were complex, but so too were the opportunities for cooperation and shared progress. In meeting halls, on video screens, and in the quiet offices of diplomats, the work of the global stage continued. It was the latest chapter in the long history of politics, one in which the fate of each nation was tied more closely than ever to the choices made far beyond its own borders. Chapter 18: Digital Voicing. The early years of the 21st century, politics entered a space unlike any it had known before. It was no longer confined to parliaments, town halls, or public squares. A growing part of the conversation moved into the digital world, where voices could be heard instantly across continents, and where the boundaries between public and private speech began to blur. The spread of the internet brought new ways for people to gather, share ideas, and organize. Social media platforms became meeting places that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. A person could sit in a quiet room and still speak to thousands, even millions, with a single post. The distance between citizens and leaders seemed to shrink as messages, questions, and challenges could be sent directly to those in power. Digital tools also changed how information moved. News that once took days or weeks to travel could now circle the globe in minutes. Images, videos, and live broadcasts allowed people to witness events as they happened, shaping opinions before official statements could even be made. This speed gave new energy to political movements, enabling them to grow quickly and coordinate across borders. Campaigns adapted to the new environment. Candidates used online platforms to share their policies, respond to questions, and rally supporters. Fundraising could happen through small contributions from thousands of people rather than a few wealthy donors. Online debates and forums allowed more voices to be heard, even from those who might never attend an in-person meeting. But the digital age also brought new challenges. The same tools that could spread truth could just as easily spread falsehoods. Misinformation and rumors could move faster than corrections, shaping public opinion in ways that were difficult to reverse. Anonymous accounts could amplify extreme views, making it harder to find common ground. The question of privacy became central. Governments, companies, and individuals all had the ability to collect vast amounts of data about people's activities, preferences, and beliefs. Some saw this as a way to better understand and serve the public. Others warned that it could be used to manipulate or control. Debates over data protection, surveillance, and online rights became part of the political landscape. Digital spaces also shifted the balance of power between traditional media and individual voices. Journalists still played a vital role in investigating and explaining events, but now anyone with an internet connection could report from the ground, share their perspective, or challenge official accounts. This openness brought greater diversity to the conversation, but also made it harder to agree on a single, trusted source of information. Movements that might once have been local could now grow into global causes. Hashtags, online petitions, and viral videos connected people who shared concerns, whether about climate change, human rights, or local governance. Supporters could coordinate actions across time zones, turning a scattered collection of individuals into a networked force. At the same time, the constant flow of information created new pressures. Political leaders were expected to respond quickly to events, sometimes before all the facts were clear. Public opinion could shift rapidly, driven by trending stories or emotional images. The pace of decision-making, once measured in weeks or months, was now often measured in hours or days. In many countries, laws struggled to keep pace with the realities of digital politics. Questions arose about how to regulate online campaigning, prevent interference from foreign actors, and ensure that the same rules applied in digital spaces as in physical ones. Some governments embraced openness, while others sought to control the flow of online information. For citizens, the digital age offered both empowerment and responsibility. It became easier than ever to speak out, but also more important to verify facts, weigh sources, and consider the impact of one's words. The reach of a single message could be vast, and so could its consequences. In this new environment, the traditions of politics, debate, persuasion, compromise continued, but they were reframed by the tools and rhythms of the internet. A post could be as influential as a speech, an online discussion as decisive as a parliamentary vote. The digital world did not replace the old spaces of politics, but it reshaped them, weaving them into a larger, faster, and more interconnected conversation. As the 21st century moved forward, it became clear that digital voices would remain a central part of political life. They could bring people together or push them apart, shed light on injustice or obscure the truth, amplify hope or deepen division. Like every tool in the long history of politics, their impact would depend on how they were used, and on the choices of those who spoke, listened, and acted within this new and boundless public square.